300 feet off a strip of sand on Matagorda Bay, there is a courthouse underwater. It was designed in 1859 by an architect named Edward Beaumont, built from shell concrete and lime, and it served as the seat of Calhoun County, Texas, for 27 years. During two of the worst hurricanes in American history, hundreds of people crowded inside its walls and survived. The building held. It saved lives. And then, because the town around it was declared dead and nobody came back, the Gulf took the courthouse, too. Today, if you wade out during a low tide, you can see parts of the old foundation beneath the water. The granite marker on shore reads, "Precious lives were saved within its walls." That's the story of Indianola, Texas, a city that did everything right except choose where to stand. In December of 1844, a German prince named Karl of Solms-Braunfels stood on a sandbar on the Texas coast and decided that this was the place. Prince Karl was the Commissioner General of the Adelsverein, a society of German nobles who had organized a colonization venture to settle Germans in the Republic of Texas. The deal they offered families back in Germany was generous to the point of fantasy. $240 for passage across the Atlantic, with wagons, tools, housing, and support promised on arrival. Thousands signed up. What they didn't know was that Prince Karl had never actually been to Texas before. He'd read about it in a novel. The prince had arrived in Galveston that summer, and then, realizing he had colonists coming and no port to receive them, went scrambling along the coast for a place closer to the hill country interior. He settled on a jut of land called Indian Point, where Matagorda Bay met Lavaca Bay, separated from the mainland by a chain of shallow lakes and marshes. He named it Karlshafen, Karl's Harbor. The first settlers arrived on Christmas Eve, 1844, stepping off one-masted schooners onto a shell beach in the Gulf wind. There were no buildings, no roads, no water supply beyond what they could catch in cisterns. Just oyster reefs, seagrass, and a German prince pointing inland. The conditions were grim. These were not frontiersmen. They were peasants, craftspeople, minor professionals, people who had paid their $240 for a promise of houses, tools, and farmland. What they got was a shell beach in winter. Some built temporary shelters from driftwood and canvas. Disease, dysentery, cholera, exposure began killing them almost immediately. The weakest didn't survive to see the spring. Those who did had a choice: push on into the interior toward the land grants the Adelsverein had purchased, or stay on the coast and try to make something out of this strip of sand between the bay and the marshes. Most pushed on. They would eventually found New Braunfels and Fredericksburg, towns that still carry their German names and their German architecture. But some stayed. A man named Johann Schwartz bought land from Sam White and built the first house. Others followed. The Adelsverein's logistics were a shambles. Prince Karl kept no financial records, spent money freely on personal comforts while his settlers starved, and was by most accounts better suited to cavalry charges than balance sheets. He was recalled within months and replaced by John O. Musbach, who was at least competent. By 1847, the German Emigration Company had sent more than 7,000 immigrants to Texas, and a significant portion of them had touched Texas soil for the first time at this spot on Matagorda Bay. What nobody in Germany had planned on, but what turned out to matter more than anything, was the location itself. Indian Point sat at the head of Matagorda Bay, one of the deepest natural harbors on the Texas Gulf Coast. Any ship heading for the interior of Texas, carrying soldiers, settlers, cattle buyers, gold miners, or the supplies that kept frontier forts running, had an almost irresistible reason to stop here. By 1846, two Anglo-American speculators named Sam Addison White and William M. Cook had laid out the town formally, surveyed lots, and started selling them. A post office opened in September 1847. Stagecoach service to San Antonio began the following January. And then, in February of 1849, a woman named Mrs. John Henry Brown gave the town the name it would carry to its grave, She took the word Indian and added the Spanish word for wave, ola. Indianola. Here is where the story turns on one man's grudge. Charles Morgan was at that moment the most powerful shipping magnate on the Gulf of Mexico. Born in 1795, Morgan had built the first regular steamship service to Texas, running his flagship Columbia from New Orleans to Galveston starting in 1837. By the late 1840s, he dominated coastal trade from Louisiana to Mexico. His problem was Port Lavaca, the established harbor on Matagorda Bay, where the port charges had grown high enough to irritate a man who did not take well to being overcharged. In 1849, Morgan decided to build his own port. He chose the area around Powderhorn Bayou, just south of Indian Point, and made it the terminus for his entire Gulf fleet. The old town of Indian Point and Morgan's new waterfront at Powderhorn merged into a single city, Indianola. It is difficult to overstate what Morgan's decision meant. This was not a subsidy or a tax break or a zoning variance. This was the man who controlled the majority of commercial shipping on the Gulf Coast, picking up his entire operation and dropping it onto a sandbar because he was angry about dock fees. Morgan was worth millions. He had built the first deepwater ship channel into Houston at his own expense. He was, in the words of one historical marker, the father of American coastal shipping. When he moved to Indianola, the money followed. Overnight, Indianola had something no other port between Galveston and Brownsville could match: regular, scheduled steamship service to New Orleans and New York. By 1858, the Morgan lines were running 3 sailings a week from Galveston and 2 from New Orleans. And by 1860, the company had a monopoly on coastal shipping in the Western Gulf. At Indianola, the wharves stretched far out into the bay to accommodate the sidewheel steamers. Corn, cotton, sugar, and beef flowed out. Settlers, soldiers, hardware, dry goods, and manufactured luxuries flowed in. As early as 1858, an average of 125 beef cattle were shipped from Indianola every week. The Morgan lines carried gold and silver overland from Mexican mines to Indianola's docks, where it was loaded onto ships bound for the United States Mint. Think about what that means. Raw, precious metal, smelted in Chihuahua or Durango, hauled by mule train across hundreds of miles of Mexican desert and Texas brush country, arriving at a little port town on a sandbar, and then put onto a steamship for Philadelphia. For 30 years, Indianola's Army Depot was the sole supply point for frontier forts across western Texas. The military road that ran from Indianola's wharves to San Antonio, Austin, Chihuahua, and on to San Diego was the shortest overland route to the Pacific Ocean. Every regiment, every supply wagon, every dispatch rider heading for the southwestern frontier passed through this town. Gold rush miners bound for California came through. So did cattle buyers from the north. So did whiskey salesmen, land speculators, and every variety of drifter and dreamer who had gone to Texas looking for a fresh start. The thing to understand about Indianola at its height is that it didn't feel like a frontier outpost. The town stretched 3 miles along the beach from the original Indian Point settlement down to Powderhorn Bayou, and its main streets were lined with commercial buildings that would not have looked out of place in Galveston or Mobile. Frederick Law Olmsted, the man who would later design Central Park, visited in the mid-1850s and wrote that approaching Indianola was so like the approach to a European seaport that we thought of our passports and the octroi officers. There were prominent gables along the waterfront. The Huck lumber yard supplied construction material. Mitchell and Company sold hardware. Multiple saloons catered to the cowboys who drove herds down from the interior. It was said that as soon as Dan Sullivan, the shipping agent who later became a prominent San Antonio banker, had made out the bills of lading, the drovers would proceed to get drunk and shoot up the town in grand style. Hotels were run by women of genuine reputation, most notably Angelina Bell Eberly, who had become a Texas folk hero during the Archives War in Austin. She had literally fired a cannon to prevent President Sam Houston's agents from removing the state archives, before moving to Indianola in 1848 and operating hotels until her death in 1860. There were multiple newspapers: the Bulletin, the Courier, the Times, the Indianolan, and their editors covered shipping news, cattle prices, and court proceedings with the seriousness of a major city press. Companies in Indianola were experimenting with canning beef as early as 1848, targeting the shipping industry, which needed provisions that would not spoil on long voyages. A city hospital opened in 1853, the same year the town was officially incorporated. Ships from New England brought cargoes of ice cut in northern winters, and stored in insulated warehouses. The ice lasted long enough that even in August, a man could get a cold drink at an Indianola bar. The Calhoun County Courthouse that Edward Beaumont designed in 1859 was built from the materials the coast itself provided: crushed shells mixed with concrete and lime, and it sat on a slight rise, the highest ground in town, a building meant to anchor a city that people expected to last. It was not grand by the standards of the brick and stone courthouses going up in San Antonio or Austin, but it was solid. It was made from the ground it stood on, and it was built to endure. And then the camels arrived. On May 14, 1856, the USS Supply dropped anchor off Indianola, carrying 34 camels, one more than it had left the Mediterranean with, thanks to a berth at sea. This was the United States Army Camel Corps, the brainchild of Secretary of War Jefferson Davis, who believed that camels could replace horses and mules for transporting military supplies across the deserts of the Southwest. Congress had appropriated $30,000 for the experiment. Major Henry Wayne had spent nearly a year buying dromedaries and Bactrians in Egypt, Tunisia, and Turkey, and hiring Arab and Turkish drivers to train American soldiers in the finer points of camel handling. One Bactrian was so tall that a hole had to be cut in the ship's deck to accommodate its humps. The scene at Indianola that May morning has no real equivalent in American history. Wayne put 4 bales of hay, over 1,200 pounds, on a single camel to prove its strength, and the animal stood up and walked off without complaint. The crowd's skepticism vanished. Horses and mules, less impressed, stampeded at the sight and smell of the creatures. The camels were marched inland to Camp Verde in the hill country, and a second shipment of 41 animals arrived the following January, also through Indianola. The experiment, by most technical measures, was a success. Camels carried double the load of mules, traveled faster, and required less water. The program died anyway, a victim of the Civil War, a change of administration, and the fundamental problem that American teamsters despised the animals. Some camels were sold at auction. Some were turned loose on the range. Reports of wild camel sightings in the Texas brush country continued into the 1940s. The Civil War hit Indianola hard, but not quite in the way you might expect. The town's economy was not built on plantation slavery. Few slaves were part of the settlement, and its wealth came from shipping and commerce, not cotton fields. But when Texas seceded, Indianola went with it, voting by a large majority. Calhoun County volunteers joined the 3rd Texas Infantry and the 6th Texas Infantry, and the town's strategic position made it an immediate Union target. Federal gunboats bombarded Indianola on October 26, 1862, then occupied and looted it. The troops withdrew after a month, but came back in November 1863 as part of Major General Nathaniel Banks's campaign to control the Texas coast, and they held the city until 1864. Fort Esperanza, which guarded Pass Cavallo, the entrance from the Gulf into Matagorda Bay, changed hands more than once. Morgan's ships were seized, some by the Union, some by the Confederacy. The railroad was damaged by overuse and neglect. The port fell quiet. But the Confederate years were an interruption, not an ending. Charles Morgan, by now in his 70s and still the shrewdest operator on the Gulf, repurchased his own seized steamers at bargain rates after the war, rebuilt his fleet, and by 1866 had restored full coastal service. He also began buying railroads, the Gulf, western Texas and Pacific to Cuero, along with other lines, understanding that the future of shipping lay in connecting water to rail. Soon, the captains and officers of the Morgan Line were becoming residents and civic leaders of Indianola and the surrounding towns. The money was back. And this is when Indianola's most extraordinary chapter began. In the late 1860s, Texas had more cattle than it knew what to do with. Longhorns were so plentiful that their meat was nearly worthless. A full-grown steer might fetch $4 in San Antonio if you could find a buyer at all. Ranchers slaughtered animals for their hides and tallow and left the carcasses to rot on the prairie. The problem was not supply. The problem was spoilage. You could not ship fresh beef from Texas to the cities of the East Coast and expect it to arrive in any condition a human being would want to eat. The great cattle drives to Kansas railheads were an attempt to solve this. Walk the beef north on the hoof, sell it at the stockyards. But the drives were expensive, slow, and brutal on the animals. There had to be a better way. A San Antonio entrepreneur named Henry Peyton Howard believed he had the answer: mechanical refrigeration. Artificial ice making was already underway in Texas. By 1867, 3 companies were producing ice in San Antonio, one of only 5 cities in the entire United States that had ice plants at all. Howard was in a race with a man named Thaddeus Lowe, a former Civil War balloonist from Dallas who had designed his own refrigerated ship, the William Tabor, using carbon dioxide compressors. But the Tabor drew too much water to dock in New Orleans harbor. Howard got there first. He fitted the Morgan steamship Agnes with a cold storage room, 25 feet by 50 feet, and loaded it with Texas beef chilled by mechanical refrigeration. In July of 1869, the Agnes sailed from Indianola to New Orleans. When the meat arrived unspoiled, Howard did what any smart businessman would do. He threw a banquet. At the St. Charles Hotel, one of the finest dining rooms in the South, he presented his transported Texas beef to the most prominent diners in the city. They ate it. It was good. The demonstration worked. The age of refrigerated shipping had begun, and it had begun on an Indianola dock. Within 5 years, frozen beef was crossing the Atlantic from America to London, 10,000 tons a year by 1874. Within a decade, the entire structure of the American meat industry, the Chicago stockyards, the great packing houses, the refrigerated rail cars, would be built on the principle that Howard proved on the Agnes. A $4 steer in San Antonio became a valuable commodity because of what happened in a cold storage room on a steamship in Matagorda Bay. Indianola had, in a single July shipment, helped launch a revolution in how the world ate. By 1870, Indianola's population had passed 2,000, and here is the fact that even most Texans don't know. In 1869 and 1870, Indianola was not the second largest port in Texas. It was the largest. For 2 years, this town on a sandbar, population a fraction of Galveston's, handled more shipping tonnage than the city that everyone assumed was the permanent queen of the Texas coast. Railroad service from Indianola to the interior opened in 1871, and by the mid-1870s, with a population exceeding 5,000, the town was at what the Handbook of Texas calls the peak of her prosperity. The Morgan lines had 3 departures a week. Cattle buyers crowded the streets. Ships sailed directly from New York and New England, bringing cargoes of ice cut in northern winters so that Texans could sip cold drinks in August. This is the moment to talk about the Sutton-Taylor feud, because it is the feud that fills the town with strangers on the night everything changes. The Sutton-Taylor feud was the longest and bloodiest family conflict in Texas history, a post-Civil War vendetta between the Taylor clan of DeWitt County and a faction that coalesced around William E. Sutton, a lawman. By 1874, both sides had grown to include up to 200 armed men. The feud reached its public climax on a steamboat platform in Indianola on March 11, 1874, when Jim Taylor and his cousin Billy Taylor ambushed and gunned down William Sutton and a companion named Gabriel Slaughter as their wives watched. Sutton had been trying to leave Texas for good. He was boarding the steamer when the Taylors appeared on the dock and opened fire. Billy Taylor was arrested. His murder trial was scheduled for September 16, 1875, in the Calhoun County Courthouse, Edward Beaumont's courthouse, the one built from shell concrete and lime. Word of the trial had spread across the state. By mid-September, Indianola was, in the words of the Texas State Historical Association, crammed with visitors. Jurors, journalists, spectators, lawyers, and armed partisans of both factions filled every hotel room and boarding house. The district court also had a second murder trial on its docket, a man named Joe Blackburn, charged with stagecoach robbery and killing. Indianola, a city of 5,000, was holding its breath for the most sensational courtroom drama in Texas. On the evening of September 15th, the barometer began to drop. The hurricane that struck Indianola on September 16, 1875, was a Category 3 storm with sustained winds of 115 miles per hour and gusts that witnesses swore reached 150. It had formed near the Cape Verde Islands and crossed the Caribbean, killing hundreds in the Antilles and Cuba before entering the Gulf. There was no warning system, no satellite, no radar, no weather channel. The first sign was the wind shifting, the bay water turning strange. By nightfall, the storm surge was driving water from Matagorda Bay into the streets of Indianola, and within hours, the entire town was underwater. The courthouse held. While everything around it was being ripped apart, houses lifting off their foundations, wharves disintegrating, ships breaking their moorings and crushing buildings on shore, the people inside Edward Beaumont's shell concrete walls survived. Not comfortably. The water rose inside the courthouse, too. People climbed onto tables, onto the judge's bench, onto whatever would keep their heads above the surge. But the walls did not break. Elsewhere in town, the situation was desperate. A Mrs. Nichols, gravely ill and having just given birth, lay on a bed that her husband and son kept raising as the floodwater climbed. On Matagorda Peninsula, the Decrow brothers, veteran ship pilots who knew the channel by heart, drowned with their families when 15 miles of the barrier island were simply swept into the Gulf. Only 3 horses in the entire town survived, saved by Sheriff Bush and 2 draymen who led them to a second-story refuge. Sheriff Bush, fearing the prisoners in the county jail would drown in their cells, ordered them brought to the courthouse. Among them was Billy Taylor, the accused murderer, and Joe Blackburn, the accused stagecoach robber. According to James W. Hatch, who recorded his memories of the storm from his San Antonio home in 1923, both Taylor and Blackburn leapt through windows into the churning floodwater and began rescuing drowning people, hauling them to safety. Hatch's own brother, D.W. Hatch, Jr., lashed himself to an open window in Dr. David Lewis's sturdy house and lassoed 20 to 30 struggling victims, pulling them from the water. The accused killers became the heroes of the night. When the storm subsided 2 days later, Indianola was gone. 3/4 of every building in town had been washed away. Only 8 structures were left undamaged. The death toll was somewhere between 150 and 300. The number was never precisely established. The lighthouses at Pass Cavallo had been swept into the Gulf, killing their keepers. Both the Decrow brothers, experienced pilots who knew the channel better than anyone alive, had drowned with their families when 15 miles of Matagorda Peninsula was simply erased from the map. The economic damage exceeded $5 million. In 1875 money, a staggering sum for a town of 5,000. And Billy Taylor and Joe Blackburn? In the chaos following the storm, Blackburn snatched Sheriff Bush's pistol. The 2 men fled on stolen horses. They were never brought to trial. Taylor, by some accounts, later sent back the horses and enclosed a $10 gift for a man who had helped them during the storm. He reportedly lived out the rest of his life in obscurity in Oklahoma. The murder trial that had packed the town with spectators the reason Indianola's population was swollen far beyond its capacity on the worst possible night, was never held. What happened next is what makes Indianola's story different from every other disaster narrative. They rebuilt. Not everyone. Many of the wealthiest families relocated to Victoria or San Antonio or Galveston, taking their capital with them. But enough people came back, salvaged what they could from the wreckage, and started over. The population shrank to fewer than 2,000 by 1880, and the town was smaller, poorer, less ambitious. D.H. Reagan rebuilt his dry goods store. Dr. Lewis reopened his drug establishment. The Morgan lines still ran, though Charles Morgan himself had died in 1878, and his shipping empire had been absorbed by the Southern Pacific Railroad. The railroad still operated. The courthouse still stood on its little rise, its shell concrete walls intact, the one building that had proved itself against the storm. People lived there, worked there, married and buried their dead there. They knew what had happened. They knew where they were. A town on a sandbar at sea level with no barrier islands between their front doors and the open Gulf. They stayed anyway. Some out of stubbornness. Some because they had nowhere else to go. Some because they had been born there and could not imagine another place as home. 11 years passed. The town hummed at a lower frequency, but it hummed. On August 19, 1886, the barometer began to drop again. The second hurricane was worse, a Category 4 storm with sustained winds of 150 miles per hour and a storm surge of 15 feet. It hit Indianola on August 20th. This time, the destruction was total. When the signal office, the Federal Weather Station, was blown down, a fire started in the wreckage and spread through the wind-driven chaos. The fire consumed block after block. By the time the storm passed, every building in Indianola was destroyed or uninhabitable except two. 46 people were dead. The details of the 1886 storm have a quality that strains belief. Railroad rails were picked up from the roadbed, with the ties still attached, and blown through the air for a full quarter of a mile, landing upright in Powder-Horn Lake. Decades later, old-timers claimed they were still standing there in the water, vertical iron markers of what wind can do. 2.5 miles of track were obliterated, cutting Indianola off from communication with the outside world and delaying any rescue effort. The signal officer, Captain I. Reed, was crushed to death when his building collapsed. A visitor from Illinois, Dr. H. Rosencrantz, died beside him. The fire that started in the wreckage consumed D.H. Reagan's large dry goods store and Dr. Lewis's drug establishment, the same men who had rebuilt after 1875, who had bet everything on this town's future a second time. Dr. Lewis escaped the fire, but drowned in the flood. The total damage across the region was estimated at $3 million. For a town that had already spent most of its capital rebuilding once, there was nothing left to rebuild with. The storm was considered even more violent than the 1875 hurricane, but because there was less town, fewer buildings, fewer people, fewer businesses, there was, in the coldest possible arithmetic, less to destroy. Fewer casualties for the same reason, fewer people to become victims. 5 weeks after the August hurricane, a third storm hit the same stretch of coast. Indianola flooded again. The remaining residents, the ones who had survived both the first and second hurricanes, were evacuated. This time with one notable exception, an elderly man known as Uncle Peyton, who refused to leave. They did not come back. The county seat was moved to Port Lavaca. On October 4th, 1887, the post office at Indianola was permanently closed, and the town was officially declared dead. It had existed for 41 years. From peak population to abandonment, 12 years. What makes Indianola more than a disaster story? What makes it a story about Texas, about ambition, about the economics of geography, is what happened after. When Indianola ceased to exist, its shipping traffic, its railroad connections, its role as the gateway to western Texas, all of it migrated north to Galveston. The rivalry between the two ports, which had been the defining commercial competition on the Texas coast for 3 decades, was settled in a single night. Galveston won by default, and Galveston's leading men looked at the wreckage of Indianola and understood briefly that their own city was in exactly the same danger. Anyone who looked at a map could see that Galveston, built on a barrier island barely above sea level, exposed to the open Gulf, was even more vulnerable than Indianola had been. Calls went up for a seawall. The calls were ignored. On September 8, 1900, the deadliest natural disaster in American history struck Galveston. A Category 4 hurricane killed between 6,000 and 12,000 people and destroyed a third of the city. Eric Larson, in his book about the Galveston storm, described the failure plainly. After the Indianola hurricanes, Galveston's leading men had briefly grasped the danger. Anyone who looked at a map could see that Galveston was even more vulnerable to destruction than Indianola. It had no picket of barrier islands to blunt a storm's approach. But the understanding faded. The seawall was never built, not until after 1900, when it was too late for the dead. The storm that Indianola had warned them about, the storm that Indianola had demonstrated with awful clarity, was not a matter of if, but when, arrived 14 years later, and Galveston, for all its wealth and sophistication, was no more ready than Indianola had been. After the Galveston hurricane, the serious money moved inland to Houston, which engineered a ship channel to the Gulf. Ironically, the same kind of project Charles Morgan had pioneered decades earlier at his own expense, and became, over the following decades, the dominant port of Texas. The chain of consequences that began with Charles Morgan's grudge over port charges at Lavaca in 1849 ended with Houston becoming the 4th largest city in America. An Indianola railroad had been proposed to connect the port directly to San Antonio, but after the 2 storms, the investors abandoned the venture. The capital flowed to Galveston, and when Galveston broke, the capital flowed to Houston. Each city built its fortune on the corpse of the last. The irony is structural, and it is deep. Indianola was destroyed because it was built on a sandbar at sea level, with no barrier islands to protect it. Galveston inherited Indianola's trade, and was then nearly destroyed for exactly the same reason. Houston inherited Galveston's trade because it was 50 miles inland, protected by geography from the thing that had killed both of its predecessors. Each city's triumph was purchased with the ruins of the one that came before. The men who built Indianola could not have imagined Houston. The men who ran Galveston could have imagined Indianola. It had happened right in front of them, within living memory, and they chose not to. There is a detail about the founding of Indianola that takes on a different weight at the end of the story. When Mrs. John Henry Brown named the town in 1849, she combined the word Indian with the Spanish word for wave. She named the city after the sea. She named it after the thing that would destroy it. If you drive to Indianola today, and you can, it is at the end of State Highway 316, about halfway between Corpus Christi and Houston. You will find a strip of sand, a few fishing cabins hiked up on stilts, a marina where you can buy bait, and a stretch of public beach where you can camp for free. It is one of the last free public beaches in Texas. There are historical markers. There is a statue of La Salle, the French explorer who established a colony near Matagorda Bay 2 centuries before Prince Karl showed up. There is a metal cutout silhouette of a camel commemorating the 34 animals that stepped off the USS Supply in 1856 and confused every horse in town. There is the old cemetery where headstones lean in the salt wind, bearing the names of people who came from Germany or Ireland or the American South and ended up in the ground of a place that no longer exists above the waterline. There are roseate spoonbills in the marshes and dolphins in the channel. Across Powderhorn Lake, 17,000 acres of the old Powderhorn Ranch have been purchased by the Texas Parks and Wildlife Foundation and will eventually become a state park. About 200 people live in the area seasonally, most of them fishermen. There is no hotel, no restaurant, no gas station. The only business is the marina, which has sold bait in one form or another for about a century. Of the original town, the wharves, the hotels, the Morgan Line offices, the Army Depot, the railroad station, the newspapers, the hospital, the streets where cattle buyers got drunk and shot up the town, the steamboat platform where Billy Taylor gunned down William Sutton in front of the man's wife. There is nothing. Not a wall, not a foundation, not a paving stone. The Gulf did not leave ruins. It left water. The courthouse is out there, though, 300 feet from shore, under the surface of Matagorda Bay. Edward Beaumont designed it in 1859 from the materials the coast provided: shell, concrete, lime. It held against a Category 3 hurricane and a Category 4 hurricane. It saved hundreds of lives. It outlasted the city it was built to govern. The granite marker on shore faces the water, pointing toward a building that is still there, in a sense, though no one will ever use it again. Beaumont built for the ages. He just built in the wrong place. In the 1850s, as many as 125 head of cattle a week were shipped from Indianola's docks. Gold and silver from Mexican mines passed through its customs house. The world's first refrigerated beef left from its waterfront. Camels brought from Egypt and Turkey at the request of the United States Secretary of War walked down its gangplanks and into the Texas interior. Frederick Law Olmsted mistook it for a European port. For 2 years, it handled more commerce than Galveston. Its population, at its peak, was building toward something that looked permanent. The newspaper editors wrote about the future. The merchants reinvested. Charles Morgan ran 3 sailings a week. The men and women of Indianola planned as though the Gulf were a partner and not a landlord. The Adelsverein, the society of German nobles that had sent Prince Karl to Texas in the first place, charged each emigrating family $240 and promised them everything. It was, as one historian put it, too good to be true. And it was. The prince kept no financial records. The logistics collapsed. The settlers who survived the crossing arrived at a shell beach with nothing waiting for them. But the ones who stayed built the town anyway, and the town became a city, and the city became, for a few extraordinary years, the busiest port in Texas. Then the wind came off the water, and then it came again, and then the post office closed, and then the bay took the courthouse. The marker on shore says what there is to say. Shell, concrete, and lime. Precious lives were saved. Abandoned 1886.